In the following conversation, a Christian apologist exposes an atheist for accepting arbitrary presuppositions that are without basis or an ultimate foundation. Notice how the atheist is unable to provide any intelligible answers to the nature of reality, but can only offer endless speculations derived merely from vain imaginations based on a limited finite observation of reality.
We're gonna come over. I'm gonna add into the stream. All right, so Mr. Evolution False, you got any kind of other name we can call you by, because it's kind of a goofy one?
You can call me Duncan.
Duncan? Okay, Duncan.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. I'm not a troll. Okay, my point is your position that you're an atheist, but you're talking about science and sciencey things.
Yes.
In order for science to be intelligible, there has to be a model of reality or a worldview that provides for its intelligibility. You cannot have a fact that is contextless, okay? Because if you maintain that, it would be an uninterpreted fact and meaningless. So, for example, as I wrote in my post, science has to presuppose a number of conceptual pillars. The first one is the reality of the external physical world. Right?
Okay.
So if you don't presuppose the conceptual framework or a model of reality that the external physical world is real, then discussion of scientific endeavors is meaningless. You have to presuppose the causal principle, that there are causal relations between events. Without that fundamental metaphysical commitment or principle, okay, in your worldview, you can't talk about science or empirical endeavors. It would be meaning.
I can agree that cause and effect is a thing.
Right. So do you understand that you need a worldview that provides for the causal principle? Okay, that's a metaphysical context that must be in place first before you can talk about evidence. You can't talk about evidence as being meaningful and intelligible if you don't presuppose metaphysically the causal principle. You understand?
So now let me stop you there. Are you talking about, when you talk about causal principle, are you talking specifically about Descartes' version?
No, I'm talking about that events are preceded by causes, that there's a cause and effect relationship between events.
Okay.
Now, as an atheist, you're talking about the meaningfulness and viability of science. So in your world, if your worldview is a worldview of chance, where all events are spontaneous occurrences and that have no causal relation, then discussion of science and evidence would be meaningless.
Oh, hang on. I gotta stop.
Let me just finish one more thing. So when you invoke science and evidence, is the world that you're invoking science is a world of chance or a world of non-chance?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but to go back into what you were saying, like to pick apart a few things. Okay, something can be chance. Like there's a chance that when I roll a dice, it'll come up any number that's on the face of the dice.
No, you're referring to probability. I'm not talking about probability. I'm talking about chance or spontaneous events that have no causal relation to anything else. So when you invoke science, do you do so in a world where all events are spontaneous and unrelated? Or are you invoking science in a world where there is the causal principle and the uniformity of nature? Which world are you in?
May I interject?
Yeah, go for it, Harry.
So my understanding of atheist worldview, especially when it comes to evolution, is not so. I don't think that chance and probability are either accurate ways of describing it, because there's the idea that there's all possibilities are accepted as having happened at some point, and that the options that survive are the ones that have been allowed.
We weren't talking about biology or evolution.
Okay, so based on everything that I could find on chance in its relation to philosophy, is chance and probability are used interchangeably.
Well, that's not how I'm using them. I explained to you that I'm talking about chance.
I'm not interested in how.
Well, I didn't say that I'm going to go by somebody else's definition. I'm asking you in the world that you're. Well, what you're doing is you're playing a game of bait and switch. I'm asking you a question. Yes, you are. You did it with the previous definition. Now, let me get this out. I'm asking you, when you invoke science, all right, that there's evidences for things, does that exist in a world where all events are unrelated and unconnected to each other? They spontaneously occur? Or is it in a world where there is the causal sequencing and laws of nature?
Okay, so laws of nature, what we describe them as, when you talk about laws of motion, things like that, those are our descriptions of the world around us. Those are things that we observe. So you
can't observe the laws of nature. That's metaphysically impossible.
No,
you can conceptualize them.
We observe phenomena in
nature. False. That's a fallacy of induction. Would you like me to explain? No. It's a fallacy of induction. Would you like me to explain?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Explain it.
Okay. Now, suppose I told you that I went on a worldwide trip and I observed white swans in every country that I went to, and I did not observe any non-white swan. And then I said to you, all swans are white as a universal. Okay? A universal is what we call a law, right? Now, if it's not universal, then it's not a law. All right. So if I told you all swans are white in virtue of the consistency of my experience, that would not be logically necessitated. Do you understand?
Okay.
You cannot observe universals. You can conceptualize them. You can appeal to a line of reasoning such as induction, but it's going to be a fallacy. It's called the problem of induction in empiricism. You cannot appeal that the whole conforms to the part, that the whole logically comports to the part. That's the fallacy of induction. So when you appeal to the let me finish. If you take any courses in science or the philosophy of science, one of the biggest problems of dealing with science is called the problem of induction. Right? Yes. So you cannot derive universals from an inductive investigation. That's a fallacy.
I agree that induction in and of itself is a problem. That doesn't mean it can't provide any answers.
No, you're not. You didn't address what I just said. I said it is a fallacy to assert the necessity of universals by an inductive process. An inductive process, by its very nature, would be incomplete. It would be a part and not the whole. So you cannot establish, unless you're omniscient, you cannot establish universals by an inductive process. That is a fallacy.
But we don't establish them as universals. They're assumptions.
Then what you are doing is you are begging the question. You are asserting that they are the case, that there are these universals based upon some consistencies. That's the fallacy of all swans are white. Now, what I'm asking you is, you want to talk about the meaningfulness, viability, and intelligibility of science. In order to do so, there have to be some prerequisites first in your world. One has to be the reality of the external physical world.
Okay.
Two, you must have that. Otherwise, statements about science become gibberish. Now, you have to presuppose the reality of the external physical world. You're also going to have to adopt the necessity of the causal principle, that there are causal connections and relations between events. If you do not start in your world or your framework that there are causal relations between events at all, then discussion of science is meaningless. You also have to hold to the uniformity of nature first. You cannot appeal to induction or empirical endeavors to establish the uniformity of nature, because the uniformity of nature is going to be needed as a precondition in order to talk about sense perception. All sense perception relies upon the precondition that nature operates in some regular ways. If you don't start with the presupposition that nature operates in some law-like or regular ways, then eyesight and hearing, touch, taste, and smell become meaningless. So you need a metaphysical framework. You need a metaphysical worldview with a number of conceptual pillars first before you can talk about science. Now, I'll ask you a simple question. Can you talk about the meaningfulness and intelligibility of science if you do not presuppose the metaphysical framework of the causal principle, that there are causal relations between events?
I guess this is where I'm getting thrown off. Why is it a metaphysical framework?
Well, hang on. I've already agreed to that cause and effect is a thing. Okay. We've already established that. So number one, why are you re-asking that question? Number two, laws of nature. Our abstractions of them, these descriptions, these are based on phenomena that we've observed repeatedly, and we make an assumption based off that observation.
Yeah, that's a fallacy. You've committed the fallacy of begging question. It's called induction. I just explained it to you.
Yes, inductive reasoning, except inductive reasoning. When you use inductive reasoning and say therefore, and you insert a universal, that's a fallacy. Where have I inserted a universal?
Okay. How do you establish the laws of nature? You said you did so by sense data and sense experience. That's a fallacy. You cannannot establish universals by an inductive process.
They were universal, did I?
Okay. If you are there
assumptions.
Okay. Well, then they are right. So then they're not established that they're necessarily the case. But you see, in order for statements of science to be intelligible, it's going to necessarily be the case that there is the causal principle and the uniformity of nature. In the case that the uniformity of nature does not exist, then statements about science become meaningless. So you need a metaphysic of the uniformity of nature first in order to make intelligible scientific statements.
No, that's incorrect.
Yes, no, it is absolutely correct. Explain to me how you can explain any empirical endeavor without presupposing by implication the uniformity of nature.
We make the assumption that the things that we have observed are going to continue to behave as we've...
That's begging the question.
Okay.
What you're doing is... That's a fallacy. You're not... Listen, I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm trying to educate you. I'm trying to educate you on the fundamental mistake here you're not understanding. If you start with an assumption and then you build on an assumption, okay? If you start with assumption X and you say, therefore Z, okay? The assertion of Z depends upon the assumption, but the assumption is arbitrary. Therefore, the assertion of necessity is arbitrary as well.
Virtually everything we do with science starts with an assumption. We make, or more appropriately, a hypothesis.
Yeah, a metaphysic.
We start with a hypothesis of...
Do you start with metaphysical presuppositions?
Do this when applied to this.
Do you start with a metaphysical framework first before you can talk about science?
As far as at least as far as cause and effect, I suppose.
Okay, so you have to have a metaphysical worldview first before you can have intelligibility for science.
Except I still haven't agreed to your whatever definition of intelligibility that you posted.
I wrote down. Well, I'll repeat it again for you. I wrote down intelligibility. That means a statement of fact or a proposition or predication means something with respect to the context or system that it is derived from. You cannot have a systemless fact. You cannot have a contextless fact. So that's why you need a metaphysical framework first, a worldview or a model of reality, before you can start talking about science. Now, most of the time, it's simply implicit and not talked about. But you have a metaphysical framework. You presuppose the reality of the external physical world. You presuppose the causal principle and the uniformity of nature in order to discuss the intelligibility of science. So I'll simply ask you a question. Do you presuppose the metaphysic of the uniformity of nature so as to have intelligibility for science.
I'll agree to it. In the interest of moving this discussion along, I'll agree to it in the hopes that you've got a point.
Okay, so you've now agreed that you need a metaphysical framework, right? You need a worldview before you can talk about the intelligibility of science. So are we on the same page?
I'll grant it to you for now.
Okay, good. As an atheist, how are you able to ascertain what the nature or metaphysic is about reality that's going to provide for any statement of fact? What is your worldview, and how did you determine it?
Like I said, it's still an assumption. I mean, that's as far as it's going to go.
So in other words, you're violating your own atheist criterion of belief. You want God to be justified, to believe in God. You withhold belief in God because God is not justified, but you adopt the negation.
I withhold belief in God based on no evidence has been presented.
Okay, that's an atheist cliche. How did you determine that all facts don't stand in causal relations with God?
Because it's an unnecessary step.
How do you know? No, that's a meaningless statement. Listen carefully to my question. When you say there's no evidence for God, that's a conclusion. You could only make. May I finish, please? Listen.
When you get what I said correct, I didn't
say there's no evidence for God.
I didn't say there was no evidence.
Okay. Okay. Well, here's the problem.
I have not yet been presented with evidence.
Yeah, okay, listen, I've heard this many times before. You've already made a determination that the sun, the moon, and the stars, the apple, the cat, okay, grass blowing in the wind, you've already made a determination in your mind that they do not stand in causal relations with God. There's only two positions on it. You cannot be neutral toward the ultimate. Are you aware of that? Whatever the ultimate is, you can't be neutral toward it.
We can explain apples and people and sun, moon. We can explain those things without the deity.
No, you can't.
How not?
Because I'll explain it to you. Because there's only two categories of fact in existence. There's the ultimate and the non-ultimate. There's the eternal and there's the temporal. Okay? So what is ultimate is the ground of all existence, the reason why anything at all exists. And then there is the dependent, things that begin to exist. Now, in order to have intelligibility or an explanation of something that begins to exist, such as a color or, let's say, an apple or anything else, you're going to need to know what is ultimate. That will be the basis of things that begin. All right? Now, since you do not accept that God is ultimate, that God is the necessary prerequisite for facts, then you are operating from some other implicit ultimacy as a context for facts. What is that?
Reality.
What is that?
Reality is the context.
So are you a monist? Reality is one?
I'm not familiar with monism. I have to.
Okay, well, monism. Well, monism means that there's just one unified set, whereas dualism is that, for example, I'm a dualist. I would hold that God is ultimate, and He creates creation, and He's distinct. There's God in His creation, so we have dualism. You're a monist, so you're appealing to what is ultimate, is reality. Now, is reality one? Or is it simply an abstract set of many?
What are you meaning by is it an abstract set of many?
Well, when you say reality, is reality an abstraction of a set of particulars and many things? Or is reality something that is just of one essence?
I can't say that I know that off the top of my head.
Well, you just told me that reality was ultimate. So I want to know what is it. I want to know what that framework actually means. Is reality one, or is it simply a set of many? Because if you're going to tell me that your ultimate
what's that, Harry?
I was going to say, from your perspective, reality would be an abstract of multiple observations akin to the scientific method.
That's what I was thinking, but as far he was going a few different places, so I want to make sure I had it straight.
Yeah.
All right, so continue, Duncan. Sorry for muting.
Well, I asked you what is ultimate that provides for dependent facts. So now what you're referring to as ultimate is an abstract set, or is reality a concrete? There's a difference between reality being it's either an abstraction or it's something concrete. Is reality one, or is it an abstraction of a set of many different things?
Based on what Harry's saying and based on what I appear to have said so far, abstraction of a set of many things.
Okay, so where do you get any universals or to unify all these many different things so that you have intelligibility? Well, if you don't, then you cannot have intelligibility for particulars. This is called the one and the many problem in philosophy. It's a perennial problem that not only afflicts metaphysics and philosophy, it also afflicts the nature of science. You have to ignore this problem to even attempt to talk about the intelligibility of science. See, if you're going to talk about the intelligibility of scientific things, you're going to have to answer the problem of unity and diversity. Now, you just told me that reality is simply an array of many particulars, that it is not just one. Okay, so you're telling me that you don't need God as an ultimate context, and I'm going to show you that what you're saying is impossible. All right, now you're appealing to the many, right? All the many particulars in existence as a framework to provide for the intelligibility of science. Now, where do you get any universals, okay, conceptual universals, to show that there is any type of unity or relationship between the particulars? Because if you don't answer that question, you don't have intelligibility for science as an atheist.
Okay.
I'm waiting.
We arrive at it through observation, except we're not saying...
No, you can't observe universals. That's a fallacy.
I didn't say they were universal, now did I?
So okay, if you don't have universals, then you...
Okay, so I'm muting him for a moment because I don't do interruptions on my show. Sorry. We make observations. I didn't say they were universals. There are what we describe as laws of nature, laws of motion, laws of thermodynamics, things like that. We arrive at these assumptions through sense data. That is the problem of induction. You don't solve that by inserting a deity. What it seems that you're steering towards, Duncan, and I'll unmute you in a moment to allow you to reply to that, is it seems that you're steering towards presuppositionalism, towards either the Van Tillian or the Bonson aspect of it, of revelatory knowledge, which is essentially a claim, attempted to make a claim of a priori knowledge with a posteriori content. So you have a priori knowledge, which is knowledge that you can claim with certainty, but it doesn't provide any actual genuine content, versus a posteriori knowledge, which is never known with 100% certainty. And I don't claim to know anything with 100% certainty. I never have. I'm not going to. But it provides genuine content about reality. And then you have this revelatory epistemology that what it seems like you're steering towards. I'm not saying that's what you are steering towards, but it seems that way. Where you're trying to claim that because God has ordained it or God has revealed it in such a way that we know to be true, and a posteriori claim of genuine content with a priori certainty. So I'm going to unmute you. Feel free to reply to that. Just needed to get that out there. You're back.
Yeah, well, what you did is you did bait and switch. You did not answer my question. You told me that reality is an abstract set of many particulars, and I said, where do you get unifiers from? Are they asserted arbitrarily in violation of your atheist criterion of belief? How do you arrive at any universals to make sense of all the array of different particulars as an atheist? Can you answer that, please?
I believe I've already answered it.
No, you didn't. In fact, when I asked you the question the first time, you muted me. Then you went into a short monologue, okay, talking about Van Til. You still have yet to answer the question. You told me you can make sense of science, okay, without the resort to an ultimate God. So I asked you, what is it that's ultimate? You told me reality. And I said, what is reality? Is it simply of one? May I finish, please? You told me that the ultimate is reality. I asked you, is that reality simply a one, or is it an abstract set of the many? You told me it's an abstract set of the many. So okay. from this set of the many, how do you, by logical necessity, arrive at any universals? You can sit there and arbitrarily assert universals by appealing to induction, but that's a fallacy, as I've already explained. Now, what I'd like to know from you, and this is the third time I've asked, how do you as an atheist derive by logical necessity any universals in order to have intelligibility of all the particulars?
It sounds like there's not.
I don't derive universality. I don't derive universals.
If you don't have universals, then you can't make sense of the particulars. It's called the one and the many problem. You have no unifiers. Universals are unifiers, like classes of things. You're going to have to establish that classes or universals are real rather than illusory. Now, in order to make sense of your world of an array of particulars, either the classes or universals are going to have to be real rather than illusory. So are the universals and classes real?
Again, we still haven't established universals. I mean, I understand.
Are the universals real?
I haven't said that there are universals, now have I?
Okay, then if you don't have, are there universals?
Keep asking how I justify universals when I don't claim universals.
Okay, so all you have is unrelated, unconnected particulars. Is that correct?
We can see cause and effect. We can.
No, you can't. That's a fallacy.
Really? Because
no, the mind imposes. No, David Hume of the 17th century refuted that. Your mind is imposing a cause and effect relationship because there's a conjunction of events. That's a fallacy. Now, I ask you, can you establish by logical necessity, by a deductive argument, that there are any universals?
Again, I haven't claimed that there are universals, so why would I offer it?
Can you have intelligibility for an array of particulars without any universals?
As far as we've defined intelligibility, which your definition doesn't really make any sense, intelligibility is the ability to be understood.
Yeah, you're not answering my question. You're dodging.
No, I'm not dodging your question. You haven't asked an intelligible question.
Can you have intelligibility for an array of particulars without there being any universals?
If there is a context to it, I can understand that context.
That answer was gibberish. Can you have intelligibility and meaning for an array of?
Your question is gibberish.
Listen, no, the question is a legitimate one. It's a philosophical one. It's called the one and the many problem. Have you ever heard of it? It's a perennial problem in philosophy. Now, you as an atheist claim that you can have intelligibility for an array of particulars. Okay, you say that there's an array of particulars out there and you can have intelligibility for science. In order to have intelligibility for an array of particulars, you have to have certain universals or classes of things, and they have to be real and not illusory. So are universals or classes of things a necessary prerequisite for intelligibility of particulars? Do you have an answer?
Not at the moment. I'm actually going through and rereading a few things on one and the many.
Okay, so you don't have an answer. So you don't have a framework for the intelligibility of the many, do you?
Just because I don't have an answer to your question doesn't mean I don't.
No, you told me you told me that you can have intelligibility for the particulars in your worldview, and you have one right now. Either you have it or you don't. Which is it?
Again, it goes back to what we're talking about as far as intelligibility goes.
I asked you a question. You're evading it.
No, I'm not evading it. So if you'll just stop interrupting me, or I'm going to mute you again, and then I'll continue my answer, which you'll call a monologue like you did the last one, even though that was the actual answer.
I'm waiting for an answer to my question.
Again, the interruptions, dude. Come on.
What unifies any particular, sir?
What unifies any?
By logical necessity, not by arbitrary declaration. How do you establish any universals to make a sense of an array of particulars?
I haven't claimed to establish any universals.
And then
going back to this.
Then does your world have any universals that you can present by logical necessity?
I don't know of any universals right off the top.
Okay, then if you don't know any universals, then laws of nature would be invoking a type of universals. So you see, on the one hand, you say you don't know you have any universals, but on the other hand, you talk about laws of nature. Those are universals.
Yes, because they're assumptions based on observation.
Are they no? So then they're arbitrary.
Yes,
are they arbitrary? Are they arbitrary then? Because if they're not arbitrary, then you're going to give me a logically necessary rationale for how you establish in a non-fallacious way these universals. Appealing to sense perception is trying to establish universals via induction. You cannot establish universals by induction. That's a fallacy. You can only do it unless
that we're not establishing universals via induction.
Are there any actual universals in your world?
I've not claimed that there are any.
Then all you have is an array of unrelated, unconnected particulars, and you don't have a background for intelligibility of science.
Based on what you're saying, okay.
Good. So now you just conceded that your worldview doesn't provide a framework for intelligibility of science, which was my initial question in the text chat.
That would be under the
except we're operating under this definition of intelligibility that you bring up that doesn't match.
Yeah, and you're doing what you did in the first time. What you're attempting to do is saying that you asked me. I'm using a term. I did not tell you that I was using the definition of intelligibility from this source, that source. I told you how I'm using the word intelligibility. Intelligibility means that a proposition, a fact, or a predication means something from within the system that it is derived. But you don't know what the system is, do you?
I don't agree to your definition.
No. The fact of the matter, I didn't ask you to agree with it. Do you have a system by which to make sense of unrelated particulars?
Science.
No, you're not understanding. You need a system first before you have science. Science is not a worldview, sir. Science depends upon a worldview. You've got it backwards. You have the cart before the horse.
All right. What are you saying, Harry? And you're getting muted for a minute, Duncan. But it's not really tending towards disorder. It's reaching to a net energy of 1 or a net. Yeah. The overall net exchange is 0. It's approaching a state of equilibrium. I mean, so, yeah, this is where philosophy breaks from science, or science breaks from philosophy, however you want to look at it. Anyway, I'm going to unmute Duncan now and let him talk. All right, Duncan, you're back.
Yeah, you've completely left the topic. Okay, everything that you say about science depends upon universals, classes and universals. Can you make intelligible sense out of the array of particulars without universals and classes?
Yes, because they're done so within a relative framework.
No, you're not understanding. Okay, I'm going to have to explain it to you. You're not understanding. You cannot make sense out of an array of particulars if there are no logically necessitated classes or universals. All you have would be unrelated particulars. The only way that you can make sense of all the unrelated particulars is that they have some relation via laws, universals, and classes. For example, if I say to you, and the apple on the counter, what I am saying is that particular on the other particular is a member of a class. The class has a unique set of properties, and in order for it to be a class, there has to be another universal, a law that secures that class. But you do not have any way to logically necessitate these laws or classes. You are simply asserting them arbitrarily. All right? Now, you want to believe that the adoption and presentation of God is arbitrary, yet you are arbitrarily asserting a world of particulars where there are classes and universals. Either you're going, in order to make sense out of all the particulars that are out there when you talk about science, in order for science to be meaningful at all, or any discussion about matters, there's going to have to be unifiers. There's going to have to be classes and universals. But you're going to have to logically necessitate that they are actual as opposed to illusory, like a doppelganger, okay? You could have somebody who's a brother with another brother, and they're in a class that is actual and is not illusory as opposed to a doppelganger. Now, what I'm asking you is, how do you as an atheist, in the grand scheme of things, how do you in a non-arbitrary fashion establish that there are universals in classes in order to have intelligibility for all the particulars? How do you do that?
You say, so I'm looking at the private chat, you say I keep on invoking classes. What classes am I invoking?
Anytime you invoke things like molecules, chemicals, laws, you cannot help but invoke universals or classes of things. Otherwise, you're going to just simply have to name all the particulars like Fifi and Fido. Okay? You can't say dogs and cats. Dogs, cats, molecules, laws, these are all classes of things. There are types of universals. Now, okay, do you have a means in your atheist worldview where you reject God as the grand universal, as the ultimate? Do you have a means that is not arbitrary to establish that there are actual universals as opposed to they are illusory?
In the interest of moving this along, I'm just going to go with, okay, they're arbitrary. What's
right?
Next?
So you've now admitted that in your atheistic outlook, you have no foundation for the intelligibility of particulars, including science.
Okay, that doesn't mean I can't make scientific observations.
No, you're not understanding. Observations, it would be a meaningless concept, because in order to have observation, you have to have sense perception. In order to have sense perception, you have to have laws. You have to have the causal principle. You have to have nature operating in some law-like ways. Can you have sense perception if nature did not operate according to some laws? The answer is no, you can't. So how do you, in a non-arbitrary way, establish that there are universals or laws? You can't do it through induction. That's begging the question.
I've already gone through this several times about I haven't agreed that there are universals, and I can't agree that there are universals. I've talked about laws of nature. I've given examples through talking about gravity and that they work in relative frames.
That's begging the question. You are just simply asserting that there are these laws. What I'm asking you is, how do you in a non-arbitrary fashion establish that nature operates in some law-like ways? If you appeal to sense perception or induction, that is the fallacy of begging the question. Now, how do you establish that there are, in fact, universals other than stating such by arbitrary means?
I haven't stated that there are universals.
Okay, so can you have intelligibility for a myriad of particulars without universals and classes?
Not based on the arbitrary definition that you put forth.
No, I didn't give you a definition. I said, can you have arbitrary? Listen, you're playing the game that you played the first time. Can you have meaning and understanding for an array of particulars without there being established by logical necessity that there are universals?
You keep asking the same question over and over, and I keep...
It's a legitimate question that you're dodging.
I haven't dodged it by saying that I don't accept that there's universals.
If you don't accept that they're universals, then you have a complete array of unconnected and unrelated particulars. Can you talk meaningfully about states of affairs if all the particulars are unrelated to each other?
Define meaningful.
Define related.
Meaning means that a proposition, predication, or fact means something with respect to the system or context that it exists in.
That's what you said about intelligibility. So now you're using the same definition.
Okay. Yeah, you're right now, you're just simply being argumentative. You are not addressing my question.
You're using the same definition for two different terms. So
you're repeating the same objection, which is not answering my question. How do you derive meaning? How do you derive meaning for an array of particulars for which you cannot establish there are any universals?
And you were asked what is meaning, and then you gave the exact same definition you gave for intelligibility. Yeah. So which term does that definition apply to?
Yeah, you're doing it. You're doing it again. Listen, this is why the conversation's going nowhere. Because you cannot answer my question, and you don't know what to say, you're going back to your initial objection over and over again. That's why you're doing it.
Because you still haven't answered the objection.
Okay. Can you have understanding for a myriad of particulars without any universals?
I can assume. No. I can assume things. Yeah. Sure.
No, I didn't ask you if you assume them. I said, can you have non-arbitrary understanding of an array of unconnected, unrelated particulars without universals?
I'm trying to figure out why we're still backtracking to universals when I just went ahead and said, okay,
because the meaning of any subject matter, including science, is going to require that we can draw relationships and have unifiers for the array of particulars. Okay? Now, it goes beyond science. It talks about everything. You said reality is an abstract set of a myriad of particulars. Now, can you have understanding of that array of particulars that you talked about without logically necessitating universals? Can you do that? It's a legitimate question of your atheistic outlook. Because if you don't have an answer, then you have no grounds to say that you have meaning for unconnected particulars.
Can I answer on Drew's behalf? Like, can I be as a
No, I want an atheist from an atheist worldview to answer the question.
Well,
I want to hear Harry's answer.
Yeah, I know you want to hear because you don't have an answer for it.
I want to hear what Harry has to say. Number one.
Yeah, of course you do, because you don't have an answer for it.
All right, so muting you. All right, so muting you.
My opinion, I'm going to give you what I believe is an atheist worldview, and then Drew can tell me if I'm getting it wrong.
Okay, sure.
Try to give
He's not asking an intelligible question. Yeah, go for it.
I'm ready.
He asked the question.
Oh, I didn't hear the answer.
I muted him. I figured you've heard him ask the same question.
Oh, what's the question?
9 different times. Ask the question one more time, Duncan.
The question, how does one make sense or have meaning for an array of particulars without the logically necessitating universals?
Okay, go, Harry.
One does not have meaning for an array of particulars. One observes them and applies them individually.
Isn't that what I've been saying?
I don't know.
Anyway.
That's incorrect, Harry. You cannot observe universals. That's a fallacy.
I said particulars.
No, Harry, how do you establish universals?
An atheist would not establish universals.
Can they establish universals, Harry?
We wouldn't. You've been told we wouldn't. I would not establish universals.
Okay. Can you have meaning and understanding for an array of particulars without universals?
No, you can't have a meaning for an array.
I'm asking Drew.
I've already told you no.
Okay. So so can you logically necessitate universals, Drew?
I've already said no, that I wouldn't even argue.
Okay, so you've now admitted that your worldview cannot provide for the non-arbitrary establishment of universals. Therefore, you don't have a model of reality that can provide for the understanding and meaning of an array of particulars.
We haven't established that there are universals.
You're not understanding.
But let's
can you have understanding for an array of particulars in whatever arrangement they are? Can you have understanding for them without there being not only actually but conceptual universals. Are universals necessary for meaning and understanding of an array of particulars, Drew?
He would say no.
Are universals necessary for meaning and understanding of particulars?
I would say no.
Okay, that's incoherent, because then you can't invoke. Then you would have to have a name for every individual particular, but they wouldn't be related to one another because there's no universals. That would be incoherent.
We group things based on observation.
No. You can't talk about observation because observation requires universals.
You're
not, Drew, you're not understanding the nature of universals. Laws of nature, the uniformity of nature, is a subset of universals. If you do not establish in a logically necessary way any universals, you can't talk about the meaningfulness of observation. Does observation necessitate the precondition of laws of nature, which are universals, Drew?
You'll have to ask that question again because I'm in the middle of reading.
Does sense perception and observation require some universals, such as laws of nature?
No, it wouldn't.
Yes, it does.
Not under an atheist worldview.
No, you're not understanding. It does require it. Observation is going to be the conjunction of sense perception and cognitive filtering. Sense perception requires the precondition, metaphysical precondition of the causal principle and universals such as the laws of nature.
Define a universal for me. I want to make sure we're working on the same page here. Define a universal.
A universal is going to be something that is true and invariant in many places. So, for example, if we talk about 10 objects in 10 different locations, and they're each apples, okay? They each possess the class which is secured by laws of nature. If you do not have laws of nature, then you cannot have the classes of apple. There would be no particulars that could be an instantiation of the class of apple. Now, the problem is simply this: is you want to dismiss that God is not necessary, but what you're not understanding philosophically is you've run into a brick wall called the one and the many. Because you want to say that you don't need God as the grand unifier, right? So, but you're going to need something that ties some or all the particulars together. But you don't have anything that ties them all together. All you have are arbitrary declaration of classes and laws. And when I ask you, do you have a logically necessary case for universals or classes or laws? You said no.
Right.
Therefore, when you do invoke classes or universals, either explicitly or implicitly, you're doing so arbitrarily. Okay? You cannot have meaning and understanding for an array of particulars without invoking explicitly or implicitly, universals, such as classes or laws. So all you're left is with an arbitrary declaration of universals to make sense of particulars. What draws all the different particulars that any one of them would act the same? That was just simply a spontaneous occurrence. In order for you to talk meaningfully about the past, the present, and the future, you're going to have to appeal that some things are the same, and that it's just not the illusion that there's something static. Because if everything is in flux, if everything is changing, then you can't appeal to any words that are unifiers. So you're not realizing the problem here.
I definitely understand the problem, and I definitely understand where you're coming from, and I agree with a lot of what you're saying, which is why I think that under an atheist worldview, science becomes this fetishist example of further classifying and creating smaller parties and redefining terms that would have otherwise already been understood.
Yeah, so if you're going to say that God, if they say that God is not necessary for meaning and understanding of any area of life, including the physical realm, then what I want to know is, what is it that ties everything together, okay, on a grand scale? The answer is nothing. When I asked Drew, what is the ultimacy of reality? When I asked him what is ultimate, he said reality. Then I asked him, is that an abstract set? So then what he's saying is the ultimate nature of what that is a myriad of particulars. Is there anything that unifies all the different particulars, Drew?
And my answer to that would have to end up being reality is what unifies them.
No. That's a dog chasing its tail. You said reality is an abstract set of a myriad of particulars. What, if anything, unifies them other than your abstraction of the set?
The answer is no. Nothing unifies them. They're all independent observations.
Other than you classifying a myriad as an abstract set. The set is an abstraction. Is the set a concrete or an abstraction? Is the set of concrete objects or is it an abstract object?
It's an abstract object.
Right. Well, then abstract objects don't stand in causal relations. You see, Drew has no unifier to appeal to. All he can talk about is that there's stuff out there. He can't talk about observation. He can't talk about sense perception because that presupposes universals. It presupposes classes of things. When I ask him to account for these things, he cannot. So, Drew, your atheist worldview can't make sense of all the particulars. All you're left with is arbitrary declarations.
Observe things.
I didn't hear what you said.
You can't make sense of it as a universal, but you can still observe things and have independent observations.
Yeah. No, you're not understanding. You're not understanding. Anytime you make a statement like that, you're breaking up.
And then someone else were to look at it, and they had a damaged chromosome, they may be colorblind and see it as green. Now, if you were to look at this universally, and as someone who believes in God, I would be able to say, well, there is an objective color. It is either red or green. We can decide this. But if you were to look at it without having that unifier, then there would be no difference in the truth or the reality for the person who's colorblind.
No. There would be nothing meaningful because do you hold to the Christian worldview?
I do.
Okay, well then if you hold to the Christian worldview, God is the grand unifier. He's the one who institutes the world and he sustains regularities. If somebody denies God by indifference, or they say they have a lack of belief, then they will either explicitly or implicitly have a unifier in mind. If they do not identify the unifier, all they have are simply unrelated, unconnected particulars. Then there would be no meaning, no understanding, no intelligibility. Okay? Now this is the problem. Good. So Drew, do you have any non-arbitrary means to establish any universals so that you can have meaning and understanding for any particulars?
Sorry, I was reading again. Go ahead.
As in your denial of God, right? Can you appeal to any non-arbitrary universal that will enable you to make sense of any particulars?
It would be subjective observation. So
yeah, I'll go with subjective observation. Yeah.
No. Observation would presuppose unifiers. Observation entails sense perception and cognitive filtering. Sense perception, in order for it to be meaningful, is going to presuppose the causal principle, causal connections, that there's something securing causal connections between events, and that nature operates in some regular ways. Can you establish in a non-arbitrary way that there are universals of laws of nature?
There's two problems with this. One, you're presupposing that in an atheist worldview, anything is quote-unquote meaningful beyond the observation.
Well, I'd like Drew to answer the question. Since you're not an atheist, the question is posed to the atheist worldview. Drew wants to maintain that he can make sense of particulars, even within the subcategory of the particulars that he calls science. What I want to know is, can you make sense of any array of particulars without establishing any non-arbitrary universals? Do you have any universals that you can establish in a non-arbitrary way to make sense of any particulars, Drew?
Hang on, I'm reading through and making sure I have an understanding of what you're meaning by particulars. So you're contrasting particulars with universals, correct?
I'm talking about particulars are things that are discrete entities. They exist apart from other entities. Now, if you told me that reality was simply a myriad of particulars, now, in order to make sense of either of them collectively or individually, what universals can you establish in a non-arbitrary way? Because if you don't establish that there's any universals in a non-arbitrary way, all you have is a collection of unrelated particulars, which you wouldn't have meaning or understanding for them. So you want to invoke observation or sense perception, but that's presupposing universals. Where'd you get the universals from, Drew?
How is it presupposing universal? So if you're talking about universals, the way I understand it is that's a class all on its own. It's talking about mind-independent entities.
No, Drew, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when I say how do you establish any universals at all?
Because
I'm making absolute sense. You just are not. You're confused and you're having trouble with this. Can you establish in a non-arbitrary way? Can you establish in a
I'm breaking from this, and I'm having a failure of understanding of Duncan in this regard because none of his definitions are meshing up with anything. He's conflating a whole bunch of stuff. Like, okay, pulling up just, independent source. Internet, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Universals are a class of mind-independent entities postulated to ground and explain relations of qualitative identity and resemblance among individuals. So that's what a universal is. So I just read the definition of what a universal is. Is that what you're talking about?
If that's the definition you want to go with it, how do you in a non-arbitrary way establish that? How do you establish universals, Drew? Then you have no way to make sense out of an array of particulars. Because every time you speak or anyone else speaks, it is inevitable that we will be invoking universals and classes of things.
Okay. But I didn't say that I invoked a universal non-arbitrarily.
Okay, what is your non-arbitrary justification for any universal? What universal do you want to put on the table?
I didn't say there was a non-arbitrary universal. I haven't put forth one. I don't have one.
Okay. Every time you speak about this world, you are invoking classes of things, which means that you, by implication, you're asserting universals. How do you account for these universals that you're invoking?
Universals are a class.
How do you establish that they are the case, Drew?
Through observation.
That's begging the question. I already explained to you why that's a fallacy.
And I've acknowledged that it's ultimately circular. Induction is what I rely upon.
Okay, so you're relying on a fallacious means of reasoning?
I'm relying on the continued reliability of induction, yes.
Okay, yeah. Okay. When you say the continued reliability, that's presupposing the world works in a regular way, which is begging the question.
No, that's supposing the world continues to work in the way that I have observed it to work.
No, when you say that you observed it, by implication, you are asserting there's a regularity of nature. Can you establish non-arbitrarily that there is a regularity of nature without appealing to a means which presupposes the regularity of nature, Drew?
Except how is talking about the law of gravity presupposing the regularity of nature when it works within a relevant framework?
No, because when you say it works, you're begging the question. You're presupposing the regularity.
I'm begging the question by saying that if I pick this up and I let go, it should fall.
Yeah, when you say should, you're saying the future will be like the past. On what grounds do you say the future will be like the past? What, past consistency?
Yes.
Good, that's begging the question, Drew.
Okay, then.
That's a fallacy.
You're just
when you
asserting that
Drew, let me illustrate to you the fallacy. It's really quite simple. A farmer goes out to the chicken coop, and there's a newborn chick. Every day for the next 15 years, the farmer comes out and he feeds the chick. On the first day of the 16th year, the chicken has an expectation due to the consistency of events that the farmer will feed it. The farmer picks it up and it cuts its head off, brings it in, and his wife cooks it for dinner. Okay. That's the fallacy of induction. Okay, when you say the future will be like the past because past futures were the same as the past, it's not logically necessitated that the future will be like the past. That is a fallacy, Drew. Now,
the future is going to be like the past. I said
yes, you did. You just did it. No, you said it should. Why should it?
Should.
Why?
Should.
Where'd you get that should from?
Previous observation.
That's
should
begging the question.
Will.
No. Should. Why should it? Why should it? No. Okay, good. Why should it? Explain to me why it should happen.
Because of the continued observation. I can make
that of the past.
Yeah.
Good. Drew, that's begging the question.
I feel the need to interject.
You're just inserting a deity. That's still
no. Drew, we're examining your worldview. Okay?
Your worldview is still up for examination.
Okay, that's fine. I'll be glad to defend my worldview, but right now I entered this video chat in the text saying that your worldview cannot provide for the intelligibility of science. In order for science to be meaningful and understandable, okay, and here we go again. You're going to the same canard again. I dropped the word intelligible because you want to play that little definitional game. Now,
because you kept wanting to move through, would you do something about whatever the hell that is?
I have something to contribute real quick.
Hang on, there's a noise going on. What the hell is that? Sorry, random alarm went off. No, you dropped the term intelligible because the definition you provided doesn't match the term, and then you just try to bring the definition in later on down the road, attaching to meaningful or meaning or understanding. You're just moving the definition around to fit whatever purpose of argumentation you've devised. And at this point, we've gone on for now 4 hours with this rabbit hole where he just asked the same question in a circle without making any sense. So I'm beyond bored with this.
I